It makes me wonder whether this is the end of punditry. Hi, I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, I'll be very honest with you. From a personal perspective, this whole reaction to the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, the protests across the country, the riots, the political debates over it, the discussion about what the president is doing or is not doing, has gotten me to a point that I think is probably shared by many Americans, which is just of almost utter discouragement and despair through this whole thing. It just seems so overwhelming. The perspectives of the opposing sides, which so many people seem to have driven themselves to, seem not. It doesn't seem like it's possible to reconcile them. The whole issue seems insoluble. And I want to really make this episode of Bill Whittle Now kind of a free-form thing, really focused on what your thoughts are at the moment. And the first question that occurred to me, and maybe this, again, probably just out of desperation, is what are we missing?
I don't know. We're missing humility. That's what we're missing. We're all filled with pride, and when we hear the other side make a point that on some back part of our mind is like gaining traction, we decide, well, fine, but we're dug into trenches, and we are all filled with pride and anger. These are not good combinations, especially together. For a cure for your despair, which everybody's feeling, I would refer you to, and in support of my thesis, by the way, I would refer you to the actions of a police officer in New York and 4 or 5 of them in Coral Gables, which has since been repeated, where a number of police officers confronting these Black Lives Matter protesters, people protesting the death of George Floyd, took a knee, which Colin Kaepernick did to protest police brutality for several years now, and which has polarized the nation. And for police officer, especially a number of police officers, especially a number of high-ranking police officers, the anecdotal stories I've heard was when these guys went and took a knee in, I'm not going to use the word, but out of respect, I was going to say solidarity, I just can't stand that word. But out of respect for the position of the protesters, when they did this, reports are protesters just got on their knees as well and started crying, and everybody started hugging each other and so on. That, when I first saw it, Scott, this is an honest question, it's a serious question, so let's deal with it seriously. When I first saw the police officers taking a knee, I was angered by it. And I was angered by it because of pride, because of my sense of pride, because I think that the entire premise of the protests is funded on absolute reality, but it has been constructed in such a way as to make it not only unfair but counterproductive to the actual argument. But put all that aside, I felt like almost like, oh, so you guys you're giving in? You're just going to admit that this whole narrative of the white police in America just driving down the streets looking for blacks to kill, you're just going to concede that? And that's when my wife reminded me about pride. And at the same time, I felt, wow, that's the power of it, and the instantaneous redemptive power of it was undeniable. And the more I think about it, and having had 12, 15 hours to think about it now, the more I realize that is in fact the case. It's pride. And there were running stories last night, I think it was on Fox, about they were showing 2 different clips. One of them was of a policeman that were arresting somebody during the riots, 4 or 5 days after the death of George Floyd. And they had a white guy on the ground, and there were 2 police officers on him, and one guy had his knee on his neck, and the other guy was on the other side putting on the wire ties. And the second policeman on camera reached over to the first policeman, took his knee off his neck and put it on his back. And split screen with that, they had a story, pictures of a white police officer, a white sheriff, marching with other blacks, and generally just getting hugged and fist bumps and the whole thing. And so it becomes clearer to me that what the protesters are looking for, not the looters, because they're not part of this at all. They're the problem. But what the protesters are looking for, given the reaction to the police taking a knee, is what the protesters are looking for more than anything is an acknowledgement that this is real. I think that is the fundamental aspect of it. I've been opposed to Black Lives Matter. I've never denied that it was real. I've always been opposed to it because the story that they were spinning was that black people were being killed by policemen, when 4% of all black murders in the country are caused by police under any circumstances. But nevertheless, when you abandon pride, you have to realize that this is not a rational issue. It's an emotional issue driven by real world events. And I think if we could retain our, well, I was going to say retain our dignity and lessen our pride. I'm not sure the two things can be done simultaneously.
Bill, when you were talking about that, especially, you used a couple of phrases that I've heard used before by you and others in the media. It seems that every time there's an incident like this, the race by the punditry is to immediately fit it into a narrative. The activist groups try to make it into a meme. And basically, a man who died by either asphyxiation or heart attack, depending on which set of medical experts you believe, a man who died on the streets under the knee of a police officer loses his actual personhood and becomes a representative of something larger. And I don't even know why this bothers me, but it's almost like we're looking around for a test case that will fit something we're upset about. On both sides of the fence, and we find this icon, this meme, so to speak, and there's really no guy named George Floyd anymore. There's a chant, there's a Facebook meme, there's a hashtag.
Yeah, we've got our protest signs already made, and we've got our reaction to the protest signs already made. They're sitting in the closet. And we're ready to use them. We got our T-shirts and our protest signs, and we know what they're going to say. There's just a line. We fill in somebody's name there, and that's exactly what is happening. The supporters of the Black Lives Matter movement, both sides are doing this, but the supporters of the Black Lives Matter movement are looking for a name because they need fresh visual evidence. I'm not applying this cynical motive to this. I'm just saying this is just the reality of the world. You can talk about, in the modern era anyway, you talk about all the injustice you want to. The world's filled with injustice and murder and has been since the world has been the world. But when you see it on television, it becomes real. And when there's a face attached, when there's an individual attached, that's when it becomes real. This is the great wisdom behind the most cynical statement of one of the greatest monsters in history. This is the truth of the fact that one life is a tragedy and 1,000,000 lives is a statistic. That is absolutely correct. Stalin got that exactly right. If you can put an individual face on something, especially if you can record it and show it to other people, then those people have a chance to experience that reality in a way that it is no longer abstract. And when it's abstract, we fill in the details that we want to, and we leave out the ones that we don't want to. And both sides do this as well. So, yes, having watched, here's what's different about this one for me. In 1992, Rodney King was also beaten nearly to death by police. The police argument was that he was resisting arrest. I have no doubt that's true. The police also argued that Rodney King had done a high-speed chase to get away from them and threatened the police lives and so on. I'd have no doubt that's true. And also that Rodney King was a gigantic guy, and I know that's true. But that was their defense. And the defense attorneys would show the videotape frame by frame. Here's where Rodney King is getting back up again. You can see him continuing violent, aggressive, blah, blah, blah. You play the tape in real time, and it's 4 guys with sticks beating the living daylights out of a guy who's on the ground. And in the case of the 92 riots, the riots were primed by the beating, which was on camera, and would not have been a factor if it hadn't been on camera. But furthermore, they were outraged at the acquittal of the 4 police officers, and I was too, to be honest with you. Then you get to situations like in the interim, get to a situation like Trayvon Martin, which was the antithesis of this. He was portrayed, the picture they ran on all the newspapers was of him 4 years earlier when he was, 13 years old. He was a 16-year-old. He got into a fight with George Zimmerman and so on and so forth. But the idea that Zimmerman simply walked out of his car and assassinated him was just not true. And then you got into the, well, he's a white Hispanic and all of this. Then you get to Ferguson and Michael Brown. And again, you've got you've got a person who is, I almost said a pre-manufactured martyr, but you got it exactly right. You have a random individual who other people plug into the martyrdom role in order to continue their agenda. And in the case of Michael Brown, you saw the video of him going into the store and roughing up the owner and then getting into a fight with the cop and so on. And so the people who support the police hear things like this and they realize, no, this whole thing is just manufactured. And that's how you get into these trenches that we find ourselves in today with George Floyd. But look, if you look at the George Floyd video and a guy who's basically got his neck, police officers kneeling on, putting his entire weight on his neck for 10 minutes. When you finally have a grown man calling out for his mother who's been dead for 3 years, there's no qualifications on this one. So here's a chance to really make the case. And of course, the second that it happens, we get the looting. And the looting, we'll just come out and say it. The looting hits one side of this argument as viscerally as the police brutality hits the other side. And now you've got this white-hot emotion of both sides.
And does a disservice to the people among whom they've insinuated themselves. Essentially, the looters have woven themselves into the fabric of a protest march and are actually tearing down the message of peaceful protesters by the violent acts that they perpetrate.
Correct. And then the whole thing spins away. And then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says that the violence and the looting is caused by Trump supporters or white supremacists who've infiltrated. I'm sure they got large numbers of black white supremacists in there to do, the lead on a lot of the actual looting and so on. And then all of the previous political baggage comes with it, and it's no longer about what happened in Minneapolis. Now it's about crime in general and police in general, and the whole thing just falls apart. That's exactly right.
Let me just finish with this thought. I was watching CNN this morning for an hour or so, and most of the coverage was, frankly, about something that President Trump did, and I don't want to talk about that at all. And then a lot of the coverage was about violence in various places around the country. But for 2 or 3 minutes, they did a story, and I wish I knew the correspondent's name, but they did a story about moments in these protest marches where protesters stepped up and defended police officers or defended businesses that looters were trying to attack, or stepped forward and embraced the police, or, as you pointed out, the police in a show of unity with and respect for the protesters, physically manifested their agreement with the general thrust of what the protesters were after. They showed this for about 3 minutes. It was beautiful.
Redemptive.
I wept. And during the course of that story, they said something about how, the nation's attention, of course, is not going to be on this. It'll be on the other things that are happening, but there's a lot of this happening. And then CNN went immediately back to the focus on the negative. And I thought, Was anybody in the production booth watching that story and saying, you know, there's a lot of good stuff happening out there. Maybe we should get more stuff like that?
Well, there's another element to the overall despair, is that CNN apparently is incapable of seeing the tragic irony of saying there's great news out there, but of course nobody's going to concentrate on that. Meanwhile, President Trump today, they don't. I don't think they can see it. I think it's beyond their ability to see that. There was a case, I think it was in Santa Monica, where you see a couple of very large young men with hammers trying to smash open a window to a piece of property. I'm pretty sure it was in Santa Monica, but I'm not positive about that. And one of these young white girls, these social justice warrior types, who I had really had nothing but genuine contempt for as a general rule, went by herself and stood in front of that store with her arms out like this. And she was beaten severely by large men. And then somebody threw a rock that appeared to hit her in the back of her head. She was unfazed by this. She called another person up, and the two of them together said, "No looting." And when you talk about, to me, this is the mirror image of the police taking a knee. This is a situation where the goodness in all people, the fundamental goodness, comes out. Listen, the ability to do things like make movies and television, including this show, stay with me on this, is only possible because of the existence of this thing here. This is the frame, right? I'm inside the frame. Who knows what's outside the frame? You know, because you've been here. Nobody else knows. There could be a circus on the other side of that camera, and nobody knows. So all we see what's inside the frame, and we never see what's on the outside of the frame. Sometimes shots can be framed to show that a crowd is bigger and so on, but my point here is this. As discouraging as it can be to see all of these people in the streets and all this confrontation, you have to think about what's not inside the frame. And I know this sounds almost infantile, but it's critically important. How many people are not out there protesting? How many people are not burning things down? How many people are just filled with a sense of sadness and remorse and a desire to make sure that this doesn't happen again? Is it 99.99999% of the 330 million Americans who are not in the streets, in the frame, throwing things, confronting the police, breaking into stores? What's the number? Is it higher than that? I bet it is. So we have to maintain perspective, and this is becoming practically a mantra with me now. In order to keep perspective on issues in a world of this kind of media coverage and saturation, you have to constantly ask yourself, what's outside the frame? If an airplane crashes, how many didn't? And if a man is asphyxiated through an act of inhuman indifference at the best case, then the fact that it's news is an indication that things as a general rule work pretty well. But it's also an indication that the outrage and the anger that is generated, that this is not a one-off problem. And I think that that a little humility on both sides would go a long way to advance the better angels of our nature, which do in fact exist. And given what's outside of the frame, the better angels of our nature outnumber the inner demons by multitudes.
I would just add to that, to put a button on this, that one of the reasons why I don't engage in social media conversations about things like this is not because I think I can't win the argument, so to speak. It's because I have an intense realization as a former journalist that I don't really know what's happening. And that humility that Bill talked about is not some sort of, angelic grace that descends upon a few people. It's just a sense of your finite humanity to understand that you're only seeing what's inside that frame that Bill described. You don't have the overall context. You don't understand how other people feel or think or why they're doing what they're doing in the moment. But there's a natural instinct in every one of us to attribute motive and to attribute character to people based on actions that we think we understand. And if you think you understand rightly, you're probably wrong. That's not to say you shouldn't use discernment and try to make value judgments, but it's to say you should come to that task with a great measure of humility and always be open to the possibility that somebody sees something different than you and that facts are not as you perceive them on the ground. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.